Welcome to week 5 of George Washington University School of Professional Studies, Homeland Security. So just a couple announcements. Adobe Connect, or I should say WebEx, we shifted to WebEx now. Session for Group 2 is this Thursday at 9 p.m. That's Group 2 this Thursday at 9 p.m. You will be briefing on the WMD terrorism topics that I've already given or are in the week 5 folder. Please get the slides to me beforehand so you can so I can display them in the WebEx. For the rest of you, you will be doing a paper, and I'll talk about that in a second. That's due next week, week from today, or week from yesterday, depending on when you're watching this. That's at 11:59, due on Sunday at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If there's questions, feel free to give me a call or shoot me an email. But I think the explanation I'll go through is pretty self-explanatory. So paper 1, everyone should have their paper 1 back. Again, most people did well. For the people, a couple of issues, just far too much background. Do not be very concise. I don't need a history of the FLN. I don't need a history of Nadal Hassan. I don't need a history of all those things. Get to your analytical points. It's irritating for me as a reader, and it's irritating in your day jobs if you're trying to write with concision to a boss who doesn't have a whole lot of time to read, and you go and drone on about irrelevant information. Do not repeat the definitions. Some people repeated the NCT definition, and repeated the FBI definition, and repeated the State Department definitions. Part of this was I wanted you to apply your own definitions or come up with criteria that you think is important for terrorism. And as I mentioned, those definitions miss things. Some of you talked about the 4 criteria that I talked about, non-state actor, political narrative. But I mentioned there are problems with all of those definitions. Criteria. A couple of you did this. I always have this issue. You use the same criteria I used in the example, context, targeting, etc. I was hesitant to give out an example for that reason. I want you to come up with your own criteria. I gave you about 15 other examples that you can choose that you could have brought in from that I brought in the lecture, and I want you to choose a couple of those to determine that this is terrorism. The other thing about criteria is that there should be a controversy regarding the criteria, and I talked about this with Group 1. Make sure that it actually limits the definition of terrorism. If the criteria is just a civilian in a non-military target, well, if I punch my neighbor, is that terrorism? Because he's a civilian, and we're out here in Alexandria at a non-military target. So make sure your criteria actually eliminates things that are extraneous. And then finally, passive voice. I think a lot of people think they know what passive voice is, but they don't. In fact, in my day job, I see this all the time. A passive sentence is direct object, verb, subject, right? Direct object, verb, subject. I don't mean to sound like your 8th grade English teacher here. That is a passive sentence. An active sentence is subject, verb, direct object. I go through all my writing, especially if I'm writing it to a boss, and I will label out, just like in 8th grade, subject, verb, direct object, indirect object, preposition, just so I can get concision in my language. Oftentimes, again, you want to eliminate passive voice, you want to eliminate prepositions. You don't want to have too many prepositions because it takes away from what you're saying as a sentence. You don't want to have too many indirect objects. You just want to keep your sentence structures subject, verb, direct object. And I go through that in my writing from my day job, and I recommend you do that going forward. So week 4 review, terrorism adaptation. Will ISIS be successful? There's talk about a second wave. You saw a couple of attacks in Iraq. Some of the groups that you had before were written off, just like ISIS had been about 6 months, a year ago, and then they revamped. Will ISIS follow that same pattern? I don't have an answer for that. It's just something to consider. What are the variables for success? What are the variables for failure? Hezbollah, one of the key points, and a couple of you brought this up, Hezbollah was successful because they always could rely on a stream of money. Um, they never had to resort to criminal, gangster-like activity to raise money, and this I think is the key ingredient why they were successful. In fact, I'm pretty certain it was. Other groups, even though they might have had a legitimate cause and legitimate reasons, in order to fundraise, they had to turn to criminal activity, which led them to be less enthused by the population. That I think is a key variable for Hezbollah. Arguably for the IRA, the provisional IRA, it was their leadership that allowed the IRA to go from a political or from a terrorist group to an entity. And you talk about McGahn and Mark McGuinness and all those folks that were able to transition successfully, while other groups like the FLN were not able to make that transition successfully. And then are we seeing schisms? Where in these terrorist groups, whether it's ISIS, IRA, Hezbollah, etc., are we seeing schisms, and how can we exploit that? And that was a key point in my lecture. And then WMD terrorism, again, you saw the dirty war. Again, I think it's a very accurate push on what a radiological device, radiological attack would likely look like. We talked to Om Shinrikyo, why Om was successful to use nerve agent, which is the most lethal type of chemical weapons. And finally, we talked about the Rajneeshi case study, which is highlighted in a Netflix documentary that came out a couple of years ago called Wild Wild West, or Wild Wild Country, I think, which is actually a very good documentary, but it talks about the Rajneeshis. And you saw a small snippet of it in the clips there, but this documentary talks about their international presence, their presence in Washington, as well as the case study that we talk about there. And that brings me to the paper. So you will have 12 to 1,500 words outside of the title page and bibliography. 1,500 words is the max. If it's 1,510 words outside of the title page and bibliography, don't hand it to me. It is designed to test your ability to be concise. Can you put a lot of thought into a limited amount of words? And you can imagine, I don't imagine you doing huge amounts of research. You might have to do some limited web surfing, but it's not meant for you to go, spend hours in the bowels of a library. And the threat scenarios: Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, Ricin, Syria and Sarin, ISIS and the plague. Those are the three scenarios they go forth. And I ask, when you're doing it, is that you look at it as if you're in the time. The New York Times wrote the AQP Ricin article in 2011. So imagine at the time, does Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula have the ability to launch a Ricin attack against the United States? Can it do it? Why or why not? And this is how it works in the real world. You might be working for a governor, you might be working for a federal official. He might read one of the articles that you see in Module 5 and say, hey, is this really real? Is this legitimate? Write me a paper by the end of the day that if I need to be worried about this. And that happens all the time in the real world. So this is kind of a real world scenario. And choose one of these and expound in detail, is it likely? And again, is it a threat? Why or why not? And then look at it from, the ability to produce the finished product, ability to transport it, particularly if you're talking about getting it from the Middle East, and actually disseminate it. And there's peculiarities in each one of these scenarios that impact those three capabilities. So again, this is like a real world scenario. Look at it like that. Choose one of these. Go in depth. No more than 1,500 words. If you're presenting, about 20 minutes, and that leaves about 10 minutes for questions. So 20 to 25 minutes around. And then, unfortunately, we can't stop in this class because it's so condensed. So we look at counterterrorism strategy from here on in. So we look at some of these readings as Zakaria, the PBS Frontline, which talks about the EU strategy, and we're going to look at U.S. counterterrorism strategy and Israeli counterterrorism strategy, where you have a documentary on that for your discussion boards. A lot this week, I know, but it's, again, in the compressed course, we have to continue on with what we have. So if there's questions or issues, let me know, and I look forward to discussion and your paper.